My brother secretly married my ex-wife and didn't tell the family. When I found out, I showed up at their anniversary party and revealed the truth to everyone. I'd always thought family loyalty was my strength, maybe even my biggest weakness. I'd always been there for my brother Lennox, covering for his mistakes, supporting him even when he was down and out or, truthfully, plain irresponsible. But, that night, as I stood in the middle of an over-the-top ballroom filled with people I thought were my friends and family, all that loyalty burned right up. Every supportive phone call, every time I'd listened to him, every last dollar I'd lent, all of it was thrown back at me in a way so raw it left me standing there, feeling like the world was closing in. I should probably start at the beginning. I'm Darius. I grew up in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in Cranford, New Jersey, the kind of place where families lived in modest homes with narrow lawns and everyone knew the dirt on everyone else. It was a town where secrets didn't last long, or so I thought. I was the dependable one. The firstborn. Got good grades, kept out of trouble. I worked hard and built my life, the whole time watching out for Lennox, my younger brother. He'd always been a little wild, always drawn to risk, a master at talking his way out of trouble. He could charm anyone with that grin of his, and for some reason, everyone forgave him. Maybe that's why I was blindsided when the biggest betrayal of my life came from him. Lennox and I had always been close, or, at least, that's what I thought. Then there was Celine. She was the love of my life. Or at least, she was supposed to be. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party, one of those fancy rooftop things in downtown Newark. I'll never forget that night, watching her glide across the room in that dark green dress, her laugh a little too loud and her smile that kind that made everything else disappear. She was ambitious, smart, and a little fiery. We had a whirlwind romance, and within a year, we were married. The next couple of years were good. Or at least we told ourselves that. We had our share of fights. I worked long hours at the dealership, and Celine's job at a nonprofit kept her stressed and overwhelmed. There was a distance that crept in, small at first, until it felt like I was coming home to a stranger. Eventually, the arguments became routine, and the love we'd once had felt like an echo of something we both wanted to remember but couldn't quite reach. One night, after one of our worst fights, Celine looked at me across the dining table, her eyes puffy from tears, and just said, "Darius, we're done. This isn't working anymore." She said it like it was a fact, something neither of us could deny, and to be honest, I couldn't argue. We divorced quietly, no lawyers, no drama, just the quiet acceptance of two people who had drifted apart. We shared some friends, so we ran into each other occasionally, but for the most part, I thought we'd both moved on. Years passed, and I eventually met Zoya. She was everything I'd wanted after the storm that had been my marriage with Celine. Grounded, warm, with a sense of humor that could break through even my darkest days. Zoya and I fell into a comfortable rhythm, and for the first time in years, I felt like I'd found someone who understood me, someone who made me want to settle down again. It was around this time that Lennox, who had been drifting from one job to another, started coming around more. He'd hang out with me and Zoya, chatting, always looking for something, advice, a favor, a little money here and there. I didn't mind, he was my brother, and I wanted to help. But I couldn't shake this odd feeling whenever he was around, like he was watching me. I brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking. Lennox was my brother. He wouldn't cross any lines with me. Then, one day, he called, his voice strangely excited. "Hey, Darius. I need you to come to this party I'm throwing next weekend. It's going to be at the Silverwood Country Club upstate." Silverwood? Since when did you start throwing parties at country clubs? I asked, laughing, but something felt off. Lennox wasn't exactly the country club type. He usually preferred the kind of places with neon lights and cheap drinks. "Oh, just trying something new. Besides, this one's for someone really special," he said, his voice slippery with charm. "Who?" I asked, curious. "You'll find out when you get there," he laughed. "Trust me, man. You're going to love it." I told Zoya about the invite, and she shrugged, intrigued but also suspicious. "He didn't say who it's for?" "Nope. Typical Lennox, though. Probably just another one of his new girlfriends," I replied, dismissing it. The night of the party, we drove up to the Silverwood, an elaborate, sprawling estate with manicured gardens and enormous chandeliers glittering through the windows. I was surprised Lennox had managed to book the place. It was a far cry from the kind of events he usually threw. The ballroom was filled with people, and I recognized a lot of familiar faces, family members, old friends, some people I didn't know. The decor was extravagant, candlelit tables, drapes that looked like they cost a fortune, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. As we stepped inside, I spotted my parents standing off to the side, looking around with the same confusion I felt. My mom waved us over, her brow furrowed. "Darius. Do you know what's going on?" she asked. "No idea. Lennox wouldn't tell me anything," I replied, glancing around. "Where is he, anyway?" Just as I said that, a voice boomed from the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. Everyone turned to see Lennox standing at the front of the room, holding a microphone, beaming as if he'd just won the lottery. He looked sharp, too, dressed in a suit far fancier than anything I'd seen him in. "I'd like to make a toast," he continued, lifting a glass. "Tonight is a very special night, because I get to celebrate with the love of my life. My wife, Celine." Time slowed. I felt a rush of heat flood my face, and my heart began to pound, the words echoing in my mind as if I'd misheard him. But there she was, Celine, my ex-wife, walking toward him, smiling that same radiant smile she used to give me. She took his hand and leaned into him as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The room had fallen silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, on us, whispers starting up, a murmur of confusion and disbelief. My mother's face was frozen in shock, and my father was gripping his glass so tightly I thought it would shatter. I took a step forward, feeling like I was in a daze, like this couldn't be real. Lennox and Celine were married? My own brother married my ex-wife and didn't even tell me? Didn't tell anyone? Lennox cleared his throat, probably realizing that no one was applauding, that the room was sinking into this tense silence. He forced a smile, pulling Celine closer. "I know this might come as a bit of a shock," he chuckled, his voice shaky, "but we wanted to celebrate with our loved ones." Celine glanced at me, her face flickering with something I couldn't read. Regret? Guilt? I wanted to believe it, but in that moment, I was numb. "Darius," Lennox began, his voice sounding almost pleading. "I know this might seem sudden, but..." "Sudden?" I cut him off, my voice sharp. "Sudden? You've been married for how long, and you didn't think to tell your own family? To tell me?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably, guests exchanging glances, the air thick with tension. Lennox took a step toward me, trying to put on that disarming grin. "Look, man, we didn't want to hurt you. We wanted to keep it private." "Keep it private? You're throwing a damn party," I shot back, my voice rising. Celine looked at me, her eyes glistening, but I couldn't tell if it was pity or embarrassment. "Darius, please, we didn't want to cause a scene." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, I think we're way past that." There was a beat of silence, then I turned to the room, raising my glass, forcing a cold smile. "To the happy couple," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm, "who managed to lie to their family, keep secrets, and pretend like everything's just fine." The whispers turned into gasps and murmurs as the weight of my words sank in. Celine's face went pale, and Lennox looked like he'd been slapped. I took a final, deliberate sip, then turned on my heel and walked out, leaving the silence hanging behind me. As I stormed out of that gaudy ballroom, I felt the weight of years of betrayal and suppressed anger pressing down on me. My mind was racing, a cocktail of hurt and fury bubbling up. But as soon as I was outside, with Zoya following close behind, the cold night air jolted me into a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. "Darius, wait," Zoya said, her hand on my arm. Her face was a mix of concern and barely contained rage. "Are you okay?" I wanted to say yes, that I was fine, but I couldn't get the words out. Instead, I just stood there, staring off into the night, breathing in the cold air. I felt humiliated, angry, betrayed. But deep down, beneath all that, I felt a strange resolve building up. "I'm going to make them regret this," I muttered, almost to myself. Zoya raised her eyebrows, a spark of intrigue flickering in her eyes. She knew better than to ask questions, she simply nodded, squeezing my hand in quiet solidarity. The days that followed were strange. Our parents called, trying to piece together what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to say much. Lennox had tried reaching out, leaving voicemails that wavered between guilt and justification. "Look, Darius, I didn't mean for it to happen this way," he'd said in one of his messages. "We just fell in love, man. I know it's complicated, but Celine and I, we couldn't help it." I didn't bother to reply. Then, one day, Celine sent me a message. It was short, just a few lines, saying she hoped we could talk, that she wanted to clear the air and maybe find some peace. I almost laughed when I read it. Peace? I thought. Did she really think that was an option? That was when the idea hit me. It was simple, and it would take time, but the satisfaction would be worth every second. The first step was contacting my old friend Callum. We'd gone to college together, and he'd recently become one of the top real estate developers in the state. We met up for coffee at a small cafe in Princeton. After catching up, I got to the point. "Callum, you still looking for property in Cranford?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Always." "Why, you got something in mind?" He replied, leaning forward with interest. "Let's just say I've got some prime leads for you." "Lennox's house, actually," I said, a smirk forming as I explained my plan. Lennox and Celine had bought their house from a family friend of ours, a property they were renting month to month. I knew the owner well, in fact, I'd helped him find a buyer when he wanted to sell years back. After a few calls, I was able to strike a deal. I'd buy the place, and Callum would handle the rest. The next part of the plan was reaching out to all of Lennox's former landlords and employers. He had left a trail of unpaid bills, missed rent, and broken contracts in his wake, and each one of them had a few choice words to say about my brother. I suggested that, as a good faith effort to make up for Lennox's poor behavior, they could send a revised invoice to his current address. In no time, they started rolling in unpaid rent notices, demands for repairs, and even a lawsuit from an old business partner. Lennox couldn't ignore them, and I knew that his financial situation would crumble under the pressure. Meanwhile, I focused on Celine. I remembered that she had always been concerned with her image, carefully curating her online presence, even back when we were together. She was still working at the nonprofit, one that depended heavily on donor support, and I knew that any hit to her reputation would be devastating. So I called up one of the larger donors to the nonprofit, an old friend of my father's. Let's just say that once he heard about Celine's behavior, he made it clear he wouldn't be donating again until some major changes were made. As expected, the nonprofit didn't want the scandal, so they placed Celine on an indefinite leave of absence while they investigated her conduct. She tried calling me then, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but I ignored them all. Then, finally, I got a message from Lennox. "Darius, please, let's talk. You've done enough." There was an edge to his voice, a trace of desperation that he usually hid so well. That was what I'd been waiting for. I messaged him back, suggesting we meet in person. We arranged to meet at an old diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where nobody would bother us. When I walked in, he was already seated, looking frazzled. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. I took a seat across from him, watching him fumble with his coffee cup. "Darius," he started, his voice strained. "I get it, all right? I messed up. I should have told you about me and Celine. But this is too much, man. The bills, the house, I'm drowning here." I leaned back, crossing my arms, and gave him a cold smile. Funny how betrayal works, isn't it? Lennox's face crumpled, the easy charm gone. "I know what I did was wrong. But we're brothers. Family. You're supposed to forgive me." "Family?" I repeated, leaning in. "Lennox, you married my ex-wife behind my back. You lied to our family, to our friends. And now you're sitting here asking for my forgiveness like you're the victim?" He sighed, rubbing his face. "Look, I know you're angry, but I love her, all right? I thought you'd understand." "Understand?" I said, my voice dangerously low. "You know what I understand? That you take what you want without caring about anyone else. You've done it your whole life. And now, for the first time, you're facing the consequences." He opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping. "So what? You're going to ruin my life because I fell in love?" I looked him dead in the eye, my voice cold as steel. "I'm not ruining your life, Lennox. You did that all on your own." I stood up to leave, tossing a few bills on the table for my coffee. As I walked away, I heard him call after me, his voice cracking. "Darius, wait. Please. Don't leave me like this." I didn't turn back. Over the next few months, things unraveled quickly for Lennox and Celine. Their house was sold, and they had to move into a cramped apartment that was a far cry from the life they'd imagined. Celine was struggling to find new work after her nonprofit stint ended, her once glamorous image now tarnished. Word had spread about what she'd done, and her reputation in the community was shot. As for Lennox, he tried everything he could to make money, picking up odd jobs, trying to smooth talk his way back into old connections, but the word was out about him too. People saw him for what he truly was, manipulative, selfish, and unreliable. Every bridge he'd built on charm alone was burned. Then, one day, I got a message from Celine, just a few lines, asking if we could meet to talk things over. I agreed, out of curiosity more than anything else, and we arranged to meet at a quiet park in town. When she arrived, she looked worn down, a shadow of the woman she'd once been. Her confidence was gone, replaced by something desperate. She sat down on the bench beside me, staring at her hands. "Darius, I don't know what to say," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect things to end up like this." I looked at her, unfeeling, waiting for whatever excuses she had prepared. "I thought Lennox was different," she continued, her voice shaking. "I thought we could build a life together. But he's not the man I thought he was. He's not you." There it was, the confession I'd known would come. I didn't respond, just watched her, letting the silence linger. She looked up, her eyes filled with regret. "Darius, I made a mistake. I thought leaving you was the right thing to do. But I was wrong. I miss you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I almost felt a flicker of pity. But then I remembered everything she'd done, all the hurt she'd caused. "I appreciate the apology," I said, my tone even. "But that's all it is, Celine. An apology. Nothing more." She looked away, biting her lip, her face falling. "I understand." I stood up, giving her one last look. "Goodbye, Celine." I walked away, feeling lighter than I had in years. As I left the park, I realized that I didn't feel anger or sadness anymore, just a quiet satisfaction. In the end, they destroyed their own lives. All I'd done was shine a light on the truth, and the rest had taken care of itself.